All right, guys, this is looking to be one hell of an episode. The meta has changed more in the last week than literally ever before. The new cards are all super powerful. The devs released a balance patch that finally nerfed Aurelia Azir, Merciless Hunter, and Rune Runner, and everything in the meta is completely different. Bandle City is maybe the strongest region in the game. Bandle Tree is looking tier 1. Xerath is probably better than Ziggs, and Darkness's win rate has dropped by the equivalent of about 5 tiers in the last week. Minimorph is completely nuts by my calculations. I expect Reddit to be complaining about it in about 2.5 weeks from now. And some potentially really unexpected old tier 3 decks have actually been making some pretty big waves as great counters to some of the new top dogs in the metagame. All that and much more on this episode of Meta Mondays, the theoretically weekly show where I go through my tier list and break down all of my decks for you guys. This is the tier list of my personally built decks of the highest performing ladder archetypes throughout all of ladder. If you want to import any of these decks we're going to be talking about in this video, you can find the pinned comment is going to have a link to the tier list that you see right in front of you. From here, you can import these decks through Mobalytics by going through each of their Mobalytics pages to find the best decks in the game. Now this week, of course, there are a ton of new decks for the new expansion, so I'm personally going to be going through in this video and talking about the new decks for the new expansion using the new champions or using some of the new cards, and those are going to be my focus in this video. Now I have, of course, gone through and updated every single deck on the site, including the ones that aren't new decks or using any new cards. And keep in mind, if you want to play one of those decks or check out, an updated version of an old favorite that you use, you can still head over to the site and import an updated version, but I won't be covering every deck in this video because I want to focus on the new decks, how they're doing, what counters them, how to play them, and how they're looking in the future. Real quick, before we get into any of the new decks, I do want to break down the patch, the mini hotfix that they gave us in the last few days. Rune Runner has gone to a 6-3, Merciless Hunter has gone to a 4-2, Shapestone now only gives +2/+1 when enabled, Flawless Duet and Flurry of Fists both cost 1 more mana. And this is a really big change on the tier list right now. Aurelia Azir is down to a middle tier 2 deck. Akshan Sivir Demacia is probably going to survive this nerf. It's not going to be a bad deck, but it will single-handedly remove the deck from tier 1 in my opinion. Now let's do a really brief meta rundown of where all the new champions ended up. So as you can see here, Sion and multiple Poppy decks are happily in tier 1. Nami has found her new home in Zoe, Nami, and Targon. Bandle Tree as its own archetype is looking pretty tier 1 so far. We'll have to see, but it's very powerful, especially at high levels. Whereas as we get into tier 2, we have Xerath Ziliean being potentially a low-key tier 2 deck that I'll talk about. Ziggs Taliyah finding its own home, although it probably, as I mentioned in the intro, probably less strong than Xerath, which I'll explain thoroughly why, but it's pretty interesting. And then, of course, we've got Darkness Control as well as Caitlyn Teemo existing in tier 3. So these ones not performing as well, but across the board, there's actually a ton of remarkable viability in these new champions. Actually, Tristana's nowhere to be found. Yeah, no, she's not on here at all. Now, I think it's time to start going down the list and breaking down all of these new decks that I have for you guys. Now, keep in mind, it's still, just a week after the expansion, so we don't have a ton of data on these. So in the next week, there might be some pretty rapid changes, but I have used the data that we have to compile this tier list. I build these decks in a very data-driven deck optimization style. And so for the most part, you'll find this list does largely reflect stats. Let's go ahead and start, however, with Sion Discard. What you're seeing in front of you is my current version of Sion Draven Discard, and this is a very powerful deck. I'm sure you've seen it all over ladder by this point. The idea of this deck is pretty straightforward. It is a discard mid-range kind of style. So unlike a Draven Jinx deck where you're just kind of like sending all your discards and making sure you're blasting your opponent's ass as fast as possible, in this case we're playing a lot more slower for a resource game, using cards that are going to draw us more cards, like discarding Lost Soul to create the Revenant and chaining back into the Lost Soul with the Revenant's Death Wish ability. as well as using some stuns like Arachnoid Sentry and spells to slow down the game, ultimately culminating in our Sion on 7. Of course, Sion will always be leveled on 7. That's the rules. He never isn't leveled. And when Sion is leveled, well, if he ever dies, then he just comes back with a rally, and that's pretty much enough to close out the game. If your opponent does not have a stun, a freeze, a mini morph, or something of that kind, they basically won't be able to win the game as soon as Sion hits the board. Now, this deck is fairly straightforward to play. It's not super difficult, although it is going to be extremely rewarding if you are a good player, because there are a lot of piloting decisions that you will have to make. It is a deck that kind of has a balance of proactivity and reactivity, which is why we call it like a mid-range deck. You can choose to be kind of like the aggressor or kind of the defender, depending on the matchup. And my personal build of it, and a lot of people are building it in kind of similar ways, but I go for a more spell-oriented synergy. I've seen a lot of people build Draven Sion in a very aggro fashion, and I do think, and generally the stats would also indicate, that that's not the best way to play Sion Discard. Basically, in a nutshell, Sion decks kind of want to be built more like Ezreal Draven rather than Draven Jinx, if that makes sense. So we slow it down with, you know, a few of these spells that you'll see in Ezreal style decks, but instead of Ezreal, we use Sion as a finisher because he doesn't make the deck full of like clunky spells, and you can balance your proactivity and reactivity much more nicely here. Reborn Grenadier is more of a blocker than an attacker. I usually mulligan this out of the opening hand, and I'm happy getting it later or in some kinds of opening hands, and you often want to be using it on defense just because you get a burst speed blocker and can shut down, you know, an opponent's unit really efficiently. Lost Soul, on the contrary, is a card that you want to keep in your opening hand because, of course, the chain that this card does with the infinite value, the fact that it cycles into the Twin Blade Revenant, which cycles back into the Lost Soul, is very good, and you do want to be drawing this when possible. Overall, this is a deck that, while being fairly simple to play, I'd recommend for players that are looking for a nice like balance of tempo pressure kind of strategy that you do have to think about a lot of things for. A lot of the, you know, choices that you have to discard and kind of like setup turns are going to take some thought, and it's a nice balance of kind of like testing your fundamentals. A great deck to learn the game on if you want to be thinking about, you know, reactivity and proactivity, because it's just a very balanced and fair deck. Well, it's fair until they drop the Sion on 7. All right, moving on, we've got next up Lulu Poppy. Lulu Poppy, another powerful tier 1 deck, and you might have seen this deck on this channel actually, because this is the deck that of course I climbed to Masters with, minus and plus a few cards. Now, this is an archetype that will go through some changes. If you check back on the tier list in the coming days, I will probably have edited this a couple of cards here, a couple of cards there, because it's an extremely flexible and adaptive deck, but it's also absurdly powerful, and I'm pretty confident that a refined version of this will be, if at least tier 1, if not one of the best decks in the entire game. The premise of this deck, if you haven't seen the video, is pretty straightforward. We use Bandle City's ridiculous value generation tools combined with Demasia's stabilizers as well as finishers in the form of Rally, right? You basically never run out of resources because of your Bandle tools. You've got Bandle City Mayor, which is generating valuable multi-region followers. You've got Loping Telescope, which is also just generating more cards. Bandle Commando is generating you free units. Basically, you will never run out of steam. You'll never run out of a board with this deck, and when that happens, you will always be able to just rally and basically win the game, because you're never rallying with a dead board, or your board is always full of units. Now, the most important combos to be aware of here are, of course, between some of the cards you're going to buff with Lulu. Using Lulu on your Fleet Feather Tracker to make it a temporarily 4/4 challenger is, of course, amazing. The other combo you can do with Lulu is buffing Yordlesmith. You can make your Yordlesmith a 4/4, which it will, of course, give itself quick attack, because Yordlesmith always gives itself quick attack. This card is absolutely ridiculous in this deck. And of course, because Yordlesmith gets empowered by Lulu, it will then activate, because activations go left to right during combat, which means the Yordlesmith will then give Lulu quick attack, which is really powerful because Lulu always has needed protection from her own attacks, right? She's always very vulnerable to getting blocked and killed. Yordlesmith works perfectly with Lulu because she supports him and he supports her back. And then to complete the triangle, you can also just use Yordlesmith with Fleet for the Tracker. Of course, even if you don't draw Lulu, your Yordlesmith will give Fleet for the Tracker quick attack, because it has 2 attack, which is basically the same thing as Young Witch Fleet for the tracker. Very, very powerful triangle between these 3 early game cards. Overall, it's a super fun deck. If you craft Bandle City decks in general, you're going to get a lot of bang for your buck because, of course, you manifest a bunch of cards. Between Loping Telescope and Bandle City Mayor and the random generation you're getting from these cards, you will have access to a lot of different cards in the game, and a lot of games will play out in pretty wacky ways depending on the random cards you get from these. I won a game last night off of getting Ruination off of Loping Telescope. So if you're looking for some tips to pick up this deck with, I would definitely recommend making sure you're thinking about your mana curve with these manifests, with cards like Bandle City Mayor and Loping Telescope. The single most important thing is to be thinking, okay, you know, I have a ton of cards in hand and I want to start vomiting them out because I don't have much of a board. So here I've got to favor mana instead of plus cards, right? So in situations like those, you want to be trying to manifest cheap cards that are giving you good value for how cheap they are, right? If you're kind of like in the later stages of the game, if you and your opponent are both kind of like low on resources, your Nexus health is high, your boards are kind of like not doing much, and you're just trading down resources back and forth, your hands are starting to get low. In those situations, you really need to be picking expensive cards from these, right? Because you just want like big units or big impact spells. The mana doesn't even really matter at that point, right? So just make sure you're looking at your hand, you're looking at the game state, and you're thinking, do I want a cheap card here or do I want an expensive chunker here? That should be your first priority when thinking about these cards. The second tip is to make sure you're generating the biggest value attacks possible to set up. Usually you're playing Bandle City Mayor on defensive turns. Oftentimes people will get baited by trying to play this because you want to play it as early as possible for the discounts, but just think if, you know, it would lead, if those discounts would lead to the best attack you could have on that turn, and just make sure you're setting up the most powerful attacks you can have. And this mentality often leads to Bandle City Mayor being played on defensive turns, but it's a super powerful card. It's a super powerful deck. This card's actually kind of disgusting. It carries every Bandle deck. This card's crazy. And then of course Poppy herself, don't get super baited by keeping her in the opening hand. I mean, she's a solid card in this list, but usually you're mulliganing deeper and she comes out a little later. And oftentimes on board states, you might not want to play her on turn 4 either. Sometimes she ends up being 5 or 6 if you just don't have a swarmy enough board. And that's totally fine. She's still great in this deck, but don't get a little over eager with your Poppy. All right, next up, we've got Bandle Tree Swarm. Now, this, of course, is a pretty similar deck in terms of some of the cards it's using. This is the deck that you also might have seen on my channel because this was the video that I put out yesterday, my guide to my Bandle Tree Swarm deck. And this is really powerful. I've just climbed, I think in that video, I climbed to like number 19 Masters NA with this, which is pretty solid, and if I have more time tomorrow, then I'll climb to at least top 10 with this deck. We'll see. But despite using a lot of similar cards, it's actually playing for a pretty different style than the last deck you just saw, the Poppy Lulu one. Basically, this deck wants to win off of the Bandle Tree. Now, the Bandle Tree, of course, is this 5 mana landmark. Every round, it creates a new follower that you haven't played yet from a region you haven't played yet in your hand, and you win the game on the spot at round start if you've summoned units from 10 regions. So what this means is you want to pair this with a color that's going to help you get new regions and slow the game down, and there's no better color or no better region than that, then of course Noxus, and that's why we're running 3 House Spiders, 3 Ravenous Flock, and a cute little Scorched Earth here. Basically, the premise of this deck is pretty simple. It is kind of like a mid-range deck. You are still swarming the board and you're chump blocking a lot, and you will put on a non-zero amount of pressure, don't get me wrong, but for the most part, this deck doesn't really care about Nexus damage, and your units should be blockers more than attackers. You are going to be winning off of the Bandle Tree most of the time, and you just want to make sure that you're playing units that are going to, be representing as many regions as you can. And that's how this deck is built. We're running 2 Fizz for Bilgewater, Poppy for Demacia, Protoporo for Freljord, Bandle Commando generates the Owlcats, which count as Ionian cards, Bomber Twins for Shrima. House Spider is a little cute because it's a Noxus card, but the Spiderling token is a Shadow Isles card, so you're getting Noxus and Shadow Isles both out of the way simply with House Spider. Then of course Loping Telescope for Targon, Aloof Travelers for Piltover and Zon, and the Bandle tree to pick up whatever you're missing at that time. So this deck is definitely quite a bit more control-y than the last one. We're going to be using our units to block, we're going to be using our spells to stop the opponent's game plan, and then of course that includes 3 Minimorph. Oh yeah, baby, you bet your ass I'm running 3 Minimorph in this deck. Not a chance it's under 3. This card will deal with so many problems just instantly. Your opponent's win condition doesn't get to do its thing anymore, and is super good in a kind of slower build that just wants to stop the opponent's game plan from working, like this Bandle tree build. The number one tip if you are looking to pick up this deck is to make sure you are thinking in the last couple of turns, as your Bandle tree is at 8 out of 10, at 9 out of 10, at 10 out of 10, you have to be thinking about reducing the amount of opponent's attacks as much as humanly possible, and whether the card you play to accelerate your Bandle tree is going to matter on that turn. So let's say you're at 8 out of 10, your last 2 regions you need are Ionia and PNZ, and it's the start of your round, right? It's your attack turn on round start, and the tree is on board, and it just put a PNZ card in your hand, just some random chunky unit, doesn't really matter. So you could play it that turn, and you would go to 9 out of 10, and then on your opponent's attack turn, you would get an Ionia card, and you'd go to 10 out of 10. But instead, you should just make sure that you're setting up a defense to survive your opponent's final attack on their turn. Because going to 9 out of 10 a turn early doesn't do anything, right? There's no reason to be at 10 out of 10 before the final round of your opponent's last attack that they're missing out on, because it ends on round start. Does that make sense? So make sure, you know, to instead of using your mana on a unit in a situation like that, you just want to make sure, if you have something better to do, something defensive, something that swarms the board, or, you know, stops an opponent's thing, that you're making sure to think about just like stopping an extra attack instead of trying to end a turn earlier, right? You're always just stopping the most attacks possible. Hopefully I explained that right, because that might be kind of confusing, but it's really important to just be thinking about the game in this way in general, not just in this deck. But if you can think about the game like that, you will be a much better player with literally every deck, actually. Next up with this deck, it's important to just make sure you are kind of like playing reactive to the opponent's game plan, and, you know, using your tools in your hand as you kind of see them, right? Like if you have a choice between using a Ravenous Flock or a group shot on an enemy's like 1 health damaged unit, look at what else is in your hand, right? If you have like multiple Ravenous Flocks, then you should actually just use a flock on a 1 health damaged unit, right? So make sure that your flocks aren't getting bricked by using your things that should be enabling your Ravenous Flocks to deal damage, to deal damage to damaged units. Like you don't want them to get bricked by you using your other things that are supposed to be enabling flocks as kill spells, right? So just look at your hand and make sure you're planning out where your spells are probably going to be going in the future, and pair flock with stuff that sets it up. Lastly, the mulligan. You're definitely going to want to mulligan away Bandle tree in most matchups. Actually, it's something you want to draw later, and that's because you actually don't want to play it that early. I think a lot of people are going to make the mistake of just slapping this on the board on like turn 5 because it does something every round start. In reality, if it creates a if it creates a follower from a region that you already have in your hand, it's actually kind of doing nothing. So what you want to do is you rarely want to play Bandle tree until you've played all the unique regions that your hand has access to. At that point, you can play Bandle tree usually around that turn, and that'll start getting you new regions, the final few that you're missing. So that's the Bandle tree deck. It's a ton of fun. It's a unique win condition. You'll see some wacky games because, like the Lulu Poppy deck, you just generate a lot of random cards, and it'll incentivize some big brain plays. Like you'll feel smart, like having to come up with plans on the fly, which is really cool. It's also pretty cheap because it only requires a couple of champions, 2 Fizz and 2 Poppy. You don't really need to, you know, cough up all the champions for this deck whatsoever. And of course, it actually shares a lot of decks in common with Lulu Poppy, so you can craft them both. All right, let's go ahead and get into the last new tier 1 deck, Nami Zoe. Now, a lot of early versions of Nami were messing around with Bandle City, with the prank package, with Nami Fizz. But Zoe Nami has gotten a lot more traction. Versions by Eniamor and Precipic have really taken the latter by storm, and right now you are looking at one such version. Now, almost always the decks on my site will be my own creations, but in this case I'm always going to be sure to specify when it's someone else's, and this is a slightly modified version based on said versions by Eniamor and Precipic. And it goes like this. The point of this deck is to flip Nami on turn 4, and they always do it. Because you pass the first 2 turns, you will then on turn 3, usually you want to drop a double trouble, which is just a nice proactive play, a way to spend your spell mana, and then your remaining unit mana on turn 3 goes back into that spell mana. So on turn 3, you just play double trouble, or sometimes like a lineup up, sometimes a make it rain, you know, depending if you don't have a double trouble. And then on turn 4, you play a quick spell into Nami, and she's flipped on turn 4. And a turn 4 leveled Nami is a ridiculous thing. There's a reason this deck is in tier 1. Now, before we go further, I will point out, as you can see from the tier list here, it is pretty hard to play compared to some of the other decks. It is like punishing difficulty, and that's because you need to know how to execute this kind of like narrow game plan. You need to make sure you're playing your cards right to level your Nami on turn 4, mulliganing very aggressively for your champions in this case. You mulligan pretty much anything that is not one of your champions, or if you have Nami, then you know you would keep double trouble. But the most important thing is making sure you have access to your champions flipping early. Now, Nami, of course, when leveled up, will be a monster to remove. At 4 health, she's actually really difficult to remove that early into the game. And when you go to remove her, well, the Nami Zoe player is going to cast a few spells and immediately just like get a few permanent buffs right away off of that. So overall, super scary when this slams the board on turn 4. Now, if you don't draw Nami, well, you've got Zoe to carry your early game, and of course you've got stuff like Fleet Admiral Shelly as kind of like a side win condition. You can get some really insane value off of Shelly and a couple Burblefish, even if you don't have Nami in your hand. But the deck truly does become like terrifying when you are able to get the Nami flipped on 4, which is a lot of the time. That's most games actually with this deck. Now, if you're going to play this deck, it is important to make sure you're keeping your a little bit of mana up. Don't just blow it all proactively. You want to leave a little bit of mana up reactively to protect your units from stuff, you know, with cards like Sunblessed Vigor, or with anything. If you have Nami on the board, she'll buff anything out of kill range with, you know, playing any amount of mana, right? But you'll also have to think pretty flexibly about this deck, because there will be a lot of cases where you'll have to use cards like Gifts from Beyond or super cool star chart to generate a card that will instantly counter a situation from the opponent. You can use star chart for an Equinox to shut down something that they're trying to do, star chart for a Moon Silver to cheat out Fleet Admiral Shelly a turn early. Actually, this deck can just do some outrageous combos with Moon Silver in general. Or of course, Gifts from Beyond is going to be pulling, you know, the deal 3 to a follower weapon. The stun weapon is going to be a, you know, a go-to. It's actually really important in this meta to stun out stuff like Poppy and stuff like Sion. And of course, Spell Thief is another card that will just generate you options. So as you're playing this deck, the number one tip after you know how you're flipping Nami on 4, that's really important. But apart from that, the number one tip is to just make sure you're always thinking about all the weapons you could get from Gifts, all the cards you could steal with Spell Thief, and what you're potentially star charting into as well. This can also go for stuns in the form of Crescent Strike. And of course, last but not least, make sure you're aware that Gifts from Beyond, Crescendum, the weapon that pulls a 2-cost unit, is always going to pull Sparklefly with this deck. And that's often what we're using Gifts from Beyond for, if we need to pull out a Sparklefly, if we have a leveled Nami or something like that, and we're looking to get more units on the board, or we're just looking for elusives to buff with any random thing. Make sure we're pulling Crescendum from Gifts from Beyond. Now, once you've kind of set up your Nami or your Shelly, this deck will kill incredibly quickly. Your elusives get ridiculously sized out of nowhere, super fast, and they'll end the game really fast. Actually, a lot of top players think that this kind of Zoe Nami build is actually potentially the best deck in the game, and we'll see. It's early days, we don't know like all the different ways to counter this, but it is on a lot of people's radar, and it is extremely terrifying as a deck. We might see a lot of this tomorrow in, you know, the world's top 64 qualifiers, right? I expect to see a lot of players banning this deck. All right, so next up we can get into some of the tier 2 decks. These are still pretty powerful decks, and it's time to talk about Xerath and Ziggs, because they're both in tier 2 together. I mentioned at the start of the video, you know, I kind of teased a little bit that Xerath is looking stronger than Ziggs. That is personally my opinion, and that sounds kind of crazy, especially because a lot of people's initial impressions of Ziggs was that he was super good, and a lot of people's initial impressions of Xerath was that he was super bad. And while both of those facts are, I mean, definitely very plausible. Like, I personally thought Xerath was bad as well, and I'm still not super big on the card. But the biggest difference between Ziggs and Xerath is that Xerath fits into a deck with a refined game plan that has an identity. And the reason behind that is actually really simple. It's this one card, the Arsenal. Now, there was a bug with the Arsenal where it had permanent spell shield. They removed that bug. The Arsenal no longer has that bug, but it did not need that bug to win games. It is a extremely powerful game ender, and the biggest difference between Xerath and Ziggs is that Xerath in the landmark archetype is at least trying to slow down the game, controlling the opponent's board and getting to the Arsenal, and Zillian and Xerath both do that very well. Once the Arsenal slaps the board, the game is maybe just lost at that point. It's really, really, really deadly, and excuse me, oftentimes there's nothing the opponent can do about it. Ziggs, on the other hand, while, you know, he's got great standalone value, he has a harder time actually fitting into a cohesive game plan, because a lot of the ways landmark decks want to win the game is going to be off of, I mean, this power card here, and Ziggs doesn't really slow the game down very much. He's trying to kind of like burn the game out, which doesn't really fit a lot of what the other landmarks are trying to do. So the jury's not out yet, but Xerath is actually looking pretty all right, just because it has a deck that it fits into. Xerath is not, you know, an amazing, powerful card statted by any stretch of the imagination. You know, it's a 4-mana 3/3 that'll do a couple of pings, but the fact that it fits into this deck's game plan with a powerful win condition is enough. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's actually talk about this deck. Now, it's a pretty straightforward landmark deck with Shurima Bandle, and of course we are using Zillian and Xerath as our champions to slow the game down. We're using new tools such as Hexplosive Minefield, which is really impactful in this deck. Obviously, just being able to stun something and then potentially do another stun is really, really great for slowing down the game plan. And we're using some of Bandle's power region tools like Pokestick, and we've even fit in a mini morph here to just shut down the enemy's game plan while not running out of resources. A couple of stress defenses are going to potentially stop an opponent attack with something big and scary like a, I don't know, a Sion, but they can also be used to keep our units alive. In particular, Xerath, when kept alive, if the opponent tries to remove Xerath and you keep it alive with stress defense, that can actually be pretty scary because Xerath flips very fast in this deck, and he can really slow down the opponent's game plan super quickly once flipped. So this deck is pretty straightforward. It's a ton of fun, and as mentioned, it's a control deck, so that means you're going to be playing reactively. You're going to be taking passes, keeping your mana open, and waiting to see what the opponent does before you are locking in most of your actions, right? You want to see what they do first and then, you know, counter it, right? That's the idea of a control game plan. So keep in mind, if you want to pick up this deck, that you just want to make sure you're thinking in reactive terms every step of the way. Now, in this deck, you're pretty much always keeping your champions in your opening hand because, you know, they're kind of like early stabilizers and they will help you out quite a bit. And the deck is very, very happy to use the power tools like Rite of the Arcane as well as Explosive Minefield, stall the game out a lot. Rite of the Arcane is actually one of the best things about Xerath is his champ spell is a top tier card. Rite of the Arcane, an amazing card, like even destroying one of your own mana gems feels totally fine from this a lot of the time. It's a really, really powerful card that will shut down a lot of opponents' strategies, despite being at slow speed. There's obviously this meme of like slow speed bad, but of course, if they actually print good slow speed cards like Rite of the Arcane, like Buster Shot is another fantastic cheap slow speed card, well, they certainly can be amazing. All right, and let's round out tier 2 by going out and checking out Ziggs Taliyah. Now, this is an interesting build because despite using the same regions, despite using the landmark identity, this is a completely different kind of deck. Like, it's using actually relatively few of the same cards as you might expect. So while the Xerath deck just wants to slow down the game until it gets to the Arsenal, Ziggs and Taliyah is all about kind of like putting pressure on the opponent. And another reason Ziggs might be worse than Xerath is because this playstyle did just get nerfed. Shapestone got nerfed, Ruin Runner got nerfed, and Ziggs decks, efficient Ziggs decks, were using Ruin Runner before, right? Merciless Hunter got nerfed. And because of those nerfs, this kind of like tempo Shurima deck doesn't make quite as much sense, especially when you have like the power tool for the Arsenal. It's still a solid deck, but Ziggs definitely not having the level of heat that a lot of people anticipated from him from the early reveal. Basically, with this deck, you're just going to want to put on pressure with big overwhelm units and threaten a lot of just kill lethals over the top. So Waste Walker is going to be growing a little bit in size. You can buff your overwhelm units with Unleashed Energy, and often this can be used to sacrifice a Hexplosive Minefield on an open attack to just stun something out of the combat. You can also use this with Hexplosive Minefield during combat. If you have a big overwhelm unit and they block with their biggest blocker, using Unleashed Energy on the Hexplosive Minefield will give your overwhelm unit 4 attack. And if they tried to block with their strongest enemy, well, you're stunning them out of combat, which will also just remove their blocker completely, and your overwhelm will go complete face. So you have a lot of quicker blowout potentials, combined with overwhelm from Heralds of the Magus, giving both Ziggs and Taliyah overwhelm, and Risen Altar being a cute 6-mana landmark that, of course, when destroyed, will summon a overwhelm spell shield 7/6 Damian the Unbound, which is also really good for this archetype, of course, because, you know, spell shield, as you guys might remember from this little card called Ruin Runner, is really neat when combined with this other overwhelm keyword. So a pretty straightforward deck to play. Just make sure that, unlike the other deck, you are playing this one much more aggressively. You want to make sure you're dealing damage while you can, and mulligan for early pivotal plays like Inventive Chemist, Rockhopper, and Ziggs. Just making sure you're getting your early pressure in while you can, so that your Ziggs, when leveled, or Taliyah, when leveled, will start to burn out the game, especially if you give them overwhelm with Herald of Magus. Okay, and with that, we've rounded out most of the new decks, but we can head over to tier 3 and check up on how Darkness and Caitlyn are doing, and it's not so hot. As I mentioned at the start of the video, Darkness decks okay, so here's the story, guys. I said Darkness was going to be bad. A lot of people thought Darkness was going to be bad. We literally all knew Darkness wasn't going to be good, but in the first couple of days of the expansion, Darkness had a high win rate. Because of course it was going to have a high win rate, guys. The deck is literally geared towards beating random shit in the first couple of days of an expansion. It beats like unrefined decks, or decks that don't have a way of dealing with a specific game plan, or decks that are just kind of like dirtling around too long. Basically, Darkness in a nutshell is really good at beating bad decks and really bad at beating good decks. Now, I want to say, obviously, it's not like bad. You know, I'm kind of exaggerating to make a point. Darkness isn't like a trash deck or anything. It's still tier 3. Like, it's still fine. You can climb with it. But, you know, it's going to be a little bit slower, a little bit harder. It's fine. You know, it's an okay deck. But, you know, I just had to get that out there because the copium was real on Darkness. Let me tell you, man. There were a lot of people that were like, oh, God, Darkness is the second coming, the next Messiah. It just blows my mind. It's a very fun deck, though, and you know, if you want to play Darkness, please don't let me turn you off of it, because it is still a cool archetype, and if you play it well, you can definitely outplay a lot of opponents with it. Okay, now let's actually talk about what this deck is doing. So Veigar and Senna, this is an extremely champion-centric deck. You need your champions to stay alive, and you need to draw them. So in the mulligan, you're going to be mulliganing deep for champions, as well as Dark Bulb, Acolyte, and Twisted Catalyzer. These are kind of your core early cards, and you don't really need much else. Although if you're against, you know, aggro or something with the early pressure, then you can definitely keep like Vile Feast, Pokestick kinds of cards. Basically, you just want to spam generate Darknesses from either your Dark Bulb Acolyte or your Veigar's on summon ability, or your Senna's attack ability will generate Darknesses, and you can use the Darknesses and make them a little bit stronger with Veigar on round start, makes your Darknesses bigger, and of course Catalyzer, when it strikes, makes your Darknesses bigger. Although this deck doesn't really have ways of protecting Catalyzer, so it's pretty much only going to strike once, unless your opponent is memeing around and on turn 2 they have no blocker. Now, these Darknesses can get out of hand incredibly quickly. That's the scary thing about Darkness, which is that sometimes it can clunk out, and it's a bit champion dependent, and you can definitely shut it down by, you know, killing their champions, or even, you know, removing some of their units. But when it gets its cards, it will go from 0 to 100 real fast. this deck. When Veigar is pumping the darknesses and they start dealing 4 or 5 damage and Veigar flips, once Veigar is flipped, it is basically over at that point straight away. He's going to be creating darknesses in the hand, and the darknesses are going to be going Nexus and just literally ending the game. And of course, naturally, the deck is built as a kind of like control shell. You want to make sure you're stopping the opponent's game plan, and we're doing so with cards like Withering Mist, cards like Mini Morph. Hey, look, another Mini Morph deck. This card is nuts, let me tell you. You know, I mean, I made a jab at Reddit, but like, I'm complaining about Mini Morph. Like, this card's crazy. Yeah. No, it's, yeah, of course it's going in this deck. Are you like 100%? Anyway. And of course, we've got cards like Ishali Sentinel that are going to give lifesteal and just make sure we are surviving to be able to get our full combo that will hopefully close out the game. Overall, this deck, as mentioned, does a pretty good job at punishing kind of like weaker builds, or decks like, for example, like Sion actually does have a pretty bad matchup table into this. So it's definitely a good counter to a couple of things in the metagame, mostly off the back of specific cards like Mini Morph that just tend to do very well into archetypes like that in general. The one thing I will say about Darkness, if you're looking for a tip for this deck, is to not be over eager playing your champions, particularly Veigar. There are a lot of games where you won't be able to play Veigar on turn 4. You know, you'll need to save a little bit of mana to maybe protect him with something like Mist Call or something like Stress Defense, depending on what your opponent is playing. And you'll definitely have to think about, you know, exactly when to time your champions. Like, ideally you'd play them early, but you don't always have that luxury. All right, and finally, we've got one more deck to break down for you guys, which is Caitlyn Teemo. Now, this is a visual bug. It should not be Freljord. I need to fix that, because Caitlyn Teemo is actually a deck that has been refurbished into Bandle. Now, this is my current build of Teemo Caitlyn, and it's a little bit lower than Darkness because it's a little bit experimental. I will be probably tweaking this as I go throughout the next several days, but people are having success messing around with some kinds of Bandle versions as opposed to the standard versions of Freljord that came out off the bat, and this version is my personal take on it. So it's an all-in trap deck, right? Caitlyn levels up off of traps, and when she levels up, she can get really scary really fast because when she strikes, she can deal a ton of damage to the Nexus right on the spot. Now, in this case, we're using some cards to trigger spells, and those being Otterpuss for pranks and Trinket Trade, which can generate an Otterpuss or generate, you know, another spell, which is 2 spells no matter how you swing it, basically. So it's getting a little late, but, you know, I'm doing math. Anyway, Puffcap Peddler, of course, is kind of like the core of any sort of Puffcap deck. And the ability to just like spam spell triggers is exactly what any sort of Puffcap deck is going to want. Now, it seems a little weird, but Insider Knowledge is quite a bit better than Hexcore Foundry in a lot of these kinds of builds. And that's why my early version of Teemo Caitlyn was running Insider Knowledge instead of Hexcore Foundry. Because as weird as it is, you might look at these cards and you might think, well, Hexcore Foundry draws like 4 or 5 cards throughout the game, and Insider Knowledge only draws 2. The thing that's really important to understand is Hexcore Foundry, to draw that many cards, you have to play it early, and it's coming out on the same turn that you want to play like Puffcap Peddler and stuff, right? Insider Knowledge is really powerful because it's fast speed. So when your opponent is attacking for their final swing at lethal into you, you can just Insider Knowledge, and sometimes they just die on the spot to the shrooms, right? So Insider Knowledge effectively costs 0 mana. Because not only are you not using mana on any early pivotal turns, but you're using your mana at fast speed on your opponent's final turn, right? So it's mana that you weren't really going to get use out of anyway, and that's why it's such an effective finisher for this deck, whereas Hexcore has kind of like problems with the specific timing of what this deck wants to do otherwise. Anyway, apart from that, in the Bandle tools, we've got Conchologist. This is a really great card that, of course, you know, just gives you a free grab at whatever other spell you might have wanted to get off of this. And of course, it's really important that this deck curve very low on mana, because you have so much draw generation and so much spell generation that you just kind of want to deal a lot of early aggressive chip damage and spend your mana very effectively, right? Very efficiently, because you know, you're drawing so many cards and generating so many cards yourself that if you curve a little too slow, the deck will clunk out. So when you compare this to Freljord builds, basically this one is playing a bit faster and a bit more aggressive. Really, we're trying to end the game on like turn 7 usually with something like Karina Mastermind and Insider Knowledge. We're ending the game pretty fast, so some early chip damage that we get off of our Autopus, off of, you know, our Econcologist or even Veteran Investigator sometimes won't go to waste. And the most important thing is just making sure we're banking some mana for the Puffcap Peddler turns, so that we can make sure to, you know, trigger some spells very early for our Peddler or our Double Peddler. And then of course just slamming Karina Mastermind on the board on turn 6 can just be absolutely devastating and just like almost win you the game on the spot if you've had kind of like a perfect curve up until then. Overall, I think this deck actually has a ton of potential. As it continues to be refined, it's not impossible by any stretch of the imagination that it could be tier 2. But for now, this unrefined build, you know, I haven't really spent too much time messing around with it. Nobody has really like come up with a refined version of this archetype yet, but it's extremely possible that, you know, I'll you know, make some changes, see how that does. Who knows, could be tier 2 in the next week. Maybe, you know, it's hard to say for sure because this is probably the least played of any of the decks that I've shown on the new decks on the section on the tier list tonight. And so that about covers it. Those are the new decks on the tier list for you guys to check out. Those are all the new decks in the expansion, but I wanted to mention one last thing before we close this video, which is in regards to some of the counters that are coming out to these decks, especially the tier 1 ones that are pretty low key, and some of the older decks that you guys might recognize. For example, we've got Lurk here. Lurk is actually pretty stonks right now, and this is something that I've mentioned a couple times on my stream, but basically Lurk does a really good job of beating a lot of Bandle City kind of decks. It does a really good job at beating Zoe Nami. We definitely might see some people sneak in Lurk into their lineups in the seasonals, for example. Well, I guess it's the Worlds, not the seasonals, but the qualifiers this weekend, the Worlds qualifiers, and that's pretty hype. Lurk has kind of like always felt pretty close as attack. Never great, but this is like the perfect meta for Lurk to shine. And of course, in addition to Lurk, we also have the second deck that's doing really well right now. Taliyah Thralls might be rising in the ranks as well. It actually has a pretty solid tier 2 win rate right now, and Taliyah Thralls is another deck. It's really hard, like Lurk, it's hard to shut down with mini morph or anything similar because you play, you know, multiple big scary threats. You're not just relying on one to win you the game. It's a very swarmy meta, so the board sweeps that Taliyah Thralls has access to is super good right now at this current point in time. And yeah, the big overwhelm units just do a really good job at getting through the current threats in the metagame, or especially if you're sweeping the opponent's blockers while you're at it, pushing additional damage. But there it is, guys. I know it's been like a week since the expansion, and I usually do these a little bit sooner, but I can't stress enough, I've been updating these frantically every single day for the past several days. And of course, you know, I want to make sure that these tier lists and especially these decks that I've built are as accurate and competitive as possible for you guys, because I don't like the feeling, you know, I've done a few of these before with like some, like, you know, a couple decks that were just like a little too experimental and it just didn't have high win rates, and I always feel bad because I personally think it's my responsibility to make sure you guys have the best decks possible, and I take a lot of pride in the tier list being as accurate as it can be. So I just wanted to make extra sure that I had a little bit of extra time to collect more stats, have more time playing around with these decks, more time talking with a lot of other top players, and figure out exactly where I wanted everything to be for this tier list. So I appreciate you guys being patient with me, and because, you know, normally I put the tier list out sooner after an expansion, but so be it. Anyway, that's it. I put a ton of time into making all these decks, and I hope you guys get some sweet refined ladder lists out of it. Thanks for those of you guys who are watching this now who stayed until the end of the video, because, you know, obviously these are pretty long and not, I know a lot of people who watch YouTube just want some shorter stuff, but I like going pretty in-depth on these and breaking down what's happening in the meta and all the new decks, so you guys know the ins and outs of as much as possible. So shout out to you guys who stuck through until the very end of the video, showing me that some of you guys enjoy content like this that's a little bit longer and a little bit more in-depth, analytical, etc. So thank you very much, and I'll see you guys next time.